issues. Bruce Ware isn't a big fan of Warfield. I am a big fan of Warfield. And it goes to some of the issues that are now coming out and becoming more fully understood. Especially the issue of auto theos and Calvin's break from the interpretation of Nicene orthodoxy that developed during the medieval period in regards to what generation means and the idea of the divine essence being communicated from the Father to the Son as being the definition of generation. And Calvin saying, "Niet." He didn't say "niet." He didn't speak German or Russian. Nein would be the German. "Niet." You know what I mean. Calvin said, no. And many Reformed people since then, like Warfield, have said no. And so there are background issues of the aseity of the Son, whether the Son is auto theos. That's one area of discussion, because that then has a huge impact on how you understand generation and spiration. And all of that has to do with what are called the opera ad intra, the internal operations of the Trinity, and how we recognize and differentiate between the Father, Son, and Spirit. The EFS controversy, the eternal functional subordination controversy, goes to the idea being promoted by Wayne Grudem and Bruce Ware, both of whom are principals in the primary controversy of compatibilism versus egalitarianism. Now look, that's an important issue. That's an important issue. As far as I can tell, that issue has followed the same trajectory, is following behind, but the same trajectory as the homosexuality issue. In other words, a high view of Scripture is directly relevant to whether you will adopt a complementarian or egalitarian perspective. Now, I know people who claim to have a high view of Scripture who call themselves egalitarians. I know one in particular that used to be a channel regular. But, as I observe it, inevitably, over time, those folks end up adopting a significantly less than conservative view of Scripture on that issue and many others. Certainly that's been the case in the denominations in which that battle has been fought out. Going back to what EFS means, the idea, I was first introduced to the idea, and I don't know that he's said anything about this, but the first person that I encountered that promoted this idea was Dan Wallace. And we were having a discussion about I've mentioned before that the one time I ever attended the Evangelical Theological Society annual meeting, one of the two things that I enjoyed the most was standing at the NET table and having an hour-long conversation with Dan Wallace about the Carmen Christi and the meaning of harpagmos in the text. And part of Dan's understanding of how he takes harpagmos is this concept of an eternal functional subordination of the Son to the Father, which you will then find. And the idea is, you see, historically, Christians have always confessed in the economic Trinity the subordination of the Son to the Father. What's the economic Trinity? The economic Trinity, of course, is the roles that the Father, Son, and Spirit take in bringing about the work of the Trinity, which is bringing about the whole drama of salvation. It's really all of creation but centered in the central glorifying act of the triune God, which is salvation itself. Which is why, the gospel is about God, it's not about us. And it's what God is doing. And so, very clearly, the Son voluntarily takes a role where he is sent by the Father. And the Spirit voluntarily takes the role where he is sent by the Father and the Son. And, one of the arguments, obviously, early on was the issue of the relationship of spiration. Does the Spirit proceed from the Father and the Son, or the Father only? This is part of the split between the East and the West in 1054 and all that kind of stuff. So, the economic Trinity, that's not an issue. That the persons take different roles. And so that's really indisputable. And many of those who oppose the doctrine of the Trinity, they confuse the economic Trinity with the ontological Trinity. Ontology, that which is in its being, ontos, the Greek term, normally participial, own. And so when we're talking about the ontological Trinity, we're talking about the Trinity not as seen by what God does, but God considered simply as God, God's being, the ontological Trinity. What a lot of people are reacting against, and appropriately so, I believe, is the assertion that in the ontological Trinity, there is a subordination of the Son to the Father, that the Son is willingly submissive to the Father ontologically, by nature. And the connection then becomes, well, if there is a natural hierarchy within the Trinity, not just economically, but ontologically, then it makes sense. This becomes the parallel for the natural differentiation of male and female. And 1 Corinthians 11:3 is brought up in regards to as God's the head of Christ, so the man is head of the female. And of course, immediately I just go, excuse me, Christ is a economic, functional, messianic term. You're way off if you're trying to read this into the ontological Trinity, but some people do. All right, so